what you often find is that you might think that you've innovated, but actually that innovation tried to enter the market many times before. And it wasn't a question of a lack of innovation. It was actually a question of a lack of willingness to pay, right?
Good evening, everyone. We have about a few seconds to 6, so we can wait a little bit. Welcome to all of you. Feel free to put on your cameras so that Raphael doesn't feel like he's speaking to himself. So feel free to do that. And there we go. We're seeing some faces.
Good evening, everyone. Evening.
Hi, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, everyone. Good to see you again, Tsiki. You well?
Yes, I am well. Lovely to see you. All right. So good evening to everyone. Welcome to the session. I am Tigi Saki, Marketing and Communications Lead at Savant Foundry. I'm just going to take you through some housekeeping rules, and then I'm going to hand over to Mr. Thabelo. He hates it when I call him that, but I like it. Head over to him, and then he will introduce the session. So this session, you are free to put on your cameras just so that you can see your lovely faces. Please stay on mute for the entire session. If you have any questions, please leave them for the end. We do have a Q&A session, but if a pressing question comes up during the presentation, just type it in the chat so you don't forget. And everything else, enjoy. And yeah, this is for you. So Thabelo, over to you.
Thank you, Nzigi, and welcome to everyone. I guess all of these events or all of these sessions are always special. So I always get into a trap of this is a special one for me. But regardless, I think this is quite special for me because we work with a lot of founders that are technical in nature by virtue of us working with deep tech and hardware founders. More often it's from research outputs in universities and the CSIR. And what we have seen is those highly technical founders, they sometimes stuck onto their first iteration of their product. And I think there is no one better than Raphael really to come and speak about how it is that, how important it is for you to work on products that are flexible or elastic or evolvable. So very important, and I'm really looking forward to this session. When we started the Foundry webinars, the idea was really to ensure that we introduce founders not only to the investment landscape, which is more commercial on the VC side, but also to introduce founders onto the best way to prototype their products, the best way for market access. As we have seen, that commercialization is always a challenge. We believe that Africa broadly doesn't have a technical challenge or an innovation challenge. There's always a challenge in converting those solutions into products that can be sellable as businesses. So we really want to ensure that we if we can mute, because I'm hearing myself there. Some echo. Great, thanks. So we have seen how products come out there, and maybe most of them, they're even better than what is already out there. However, what makes a product a business, it's everything in and around the product, and the product is really just one of the components of what makes a business. And as much as other components are flexible, from employees to your business model, even the product itself needs to be very flexible to ensure that it evolves with the needs of the customers. And I really hope that we get more value in what we're going to do here today with Raphael's presentation. And I look forward to that and how it is that we can apply some of the strategies in terms of taking our technologies to market. We've got a bigger problem in South Africa and broadly in Africa, where we now have more solutions than problems. And if you think about it, there are a lot of problems that we have. And if I'm saying that we have more solutions than problems, then we have a bigger problem, because now solutions are looking for for problem to solve. And it's simply because we have solutions that are not accurate in solving the problems, then they just become those redundant solutions that no one can fund. Because if you come to us as a VC and it's commercial funding, we look for products that are presented to us as a business opportunity, as an investment opportunity. And more founders that come from universities, TTOs, research councils, and those that have got background in raising funding on DFIs like Technology Innovation Agency, all these government agencies, they sort of have, and this is our experience, a grant-minded kind of an approach. And these people, they exhaust the grant funding across different entities and fail to attract commercial funding. And one of those things is because they can't present a business as an investment opportunity. They can't demonstrate how scalable their product would be. And I hope Raphael allude to those kind of things in terms of scalability of your product, how the product should actually scale with the business as well. Over to you, Raphael, and thank you.
Great. Let me get my screen sharing here quickly, and then we'll pick up. Thabelo, can you see my screen on your side here?
Yes, can see your screen.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to contribute to growing this ecosystem. Without repeating too much of what you said, just to say that we're very much aligned and agree with your perspective, and I think that's why we like working with you so much, is that you are paying attention to the patterns in the ecosystem and what it takes to actually be successful and adapting to that yourselves. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to discuss what businesses and products need to look like to be successful in the startup and innovation ecosystem. So to give a brief overview, I'm going to explore a little bit what an evolvable product actually is and why it matters. I'm then going to talk about elastic design, which is our systemic approach to achieving an evolvable product and a company. The two go hand in hand. And then I'll touch on a couple of points about how you can actually implement this and what that would look like inside of your business. And then we'll do some Q&A at the end. Okay, so what is an evolvable product? Thabelo touched on this earlier, which is that we need to be very careful about finding a solution and developing a solution and then trying to find a problem to suit that solution. Now, I actually think that, over the last 5 or 10 years, the startup ecosystem has done quite well to guide innovators away from that particular trap. So innovators are quite good at finding a problem and solving that problem. The challenge is that they may not find that problem or understand that problem in the context of what is actually going to be a commercially viable problem to solve, all right? And the reason that that's so difficult is it's hard to get a handle on what that looks like from the outside or before you get to the point where you're actually trying to sell that product into the market, right? And there are many things that impact that. And this looks slightly different for every type of business, but these are some of the high-level points that are important for us that I'm going to touch on tonight. So that's your choice of investment. It's market requirements. It is your architecture for whatever technology you're developing, the actual detailed design implementation of that, how you choose to manufacture that product, what your choice of suppliers are, and then also your intellectual property management, right? And you'll see on this graph, represented by the orange bands, is the market requirement, okay? So how those things move. You might have a competitor with intellectual property. You might have investment challenges. You might have manufacturing challenges. And you can see that those market levers might fall outside of what you've built, which is represented by the white dots on this graph. And the more flexible you can make your product and business, the easier it will be, and the lower overhead in terms of time and budget it'll take to adapt to those changing market demands. All right. And this doesn't only happen because of changes in the market, it also happens over time as your product develops into the market. All right. So it's a combination of you learning more information, of the requirements developing over time, and then external changes as well. And I think the last point I want to make is that the landscape of building moat in the context of product development and building something that, as Thabelo said, is investable, all right? What that means is changing quite rapidly with the advent of AI. So whereas 5 or 10 years ago, you could rely on quite a large extent to the protection that you got from the implementation stage. So it was hard to do the work. Now, AI doesn't take all the work away, but there's certainly areas where it drastically accelerates that work. And there's certainly areas where it does actually just completely take that work away. So the question then becomes, what gives you a competitive edge in the market? As Thabelo said, when there's thousands of solutions for one problem, what gives you that edge? And I'd argue that having an evolvable product that can adapt to any small change in the market demands, right, and cover a larger portion of the market is what's going to give you that edge and make you competitive in that landscape. Okay, so elastic design, as I said, is our systemic approach to addressing these problems. So how do we implement this consistently in the projects that we're involved in, and how can you do the same? So I'm going to take the example of a market requirement and explore that in a little bit more detail. So you go into the market and you want to build a product. Let's say it's a scale for weighing fruit, for example, right? And you walk into a supermarket and you say, I want to build a scale. How much does it need to weigh? And they tell you, look, we only weigh stuff that people can pick up in a bag. And you go, okay, well, it's never going to need to weigh more than 50 kilograms. All right. So that's your baseline requirement. You're 99% sure this scale that you're developing only needs to weigh stuff that weighs less than 50 kilograms. But you need to ask yourself, what market exposure do you have? How much market research have you done? So, you know, there is a likelihood, right, however small it may be, that you've gotten that market requirement wrong and that it might shift. You might go back next week. There might be another person that you speak to. You might go to another supermarket. You might actually realize that there's no market selling to supermarkets for weighing fruit, and that you actually need to build a scale for weighing trucks, right? And the question that you need to ask yourself is, what is the likelihood of that requirement changing from 50 kilograms to 100 kilograms to 1,000 kilograms? And then what is the severity? What is the consequence of that changing? So is it going to be, you know, a very small change to switch out one mechanical component? Am I going to have to redesign the electronics from scratch? And again, it shifts into other areas of the business. Is my IP going to need to change completely? Is my marketing going to need to change completely? All right. So while you can focus in a particular area, it's always worth asking the question, what is the severity and likelihood of that requirement shifting? Okay. And the difference between conventional product development and business design is that it's very targeted around identifying your niche and then hitting your niche as hard as you can, all right? Whereas elastic design acknowledges the reality, and it is a reality, that you don't know what that niche is until you've actually made sales at your target revenue into the market, and says, how can we make our design and our business as dynamic so that it can respond with the lowest cost and as quickly as possible to market shifts, all right, without at the same time killing our development because it's too expensive to accommodate everyone. So it's a very careful balance, but it is something that is very worthwhile investing the time in doing. And in a nutshell, that's elastic design, is crafting the balance between being flexible and being focused. Right, so I'm now going to talk about, the implementation layer, about what elastic design looks like in different contexts. And the first one of those I'm going to talk about is investment vehicle selection. All right, now, some might say this is outside the scope of a technical conversation, but it very much isn't. All right, and I think that the earlier you understand this, the more successful you're going to be in raising the appropriate type of funding that's going to secure that your venture is successful. All right. So what we see a lot, for example, is that people will come to us and they will say, oh, we've got a prototype and it's a solution fit because we've taken it to some people and they really like it. So they think that they are finishing up this prototype and solution fit phase of things, all right? And so they are on the cusp of trying to secure venture capital funding because they think that they've finished this stage and the venture capital funding is going to give them a huge amount of capital to do everything that they want to do, all right? But when we look at projects and we've seen what they look like at this prototype stage and the validation stage, we'll say, actually, you are maybe a third of the way through your prototyping stage. And what you actually need to secure is angel or seed funding, or even grant funding still, that's going to allow you to really develop your technology to the point where you really are at this validation stage. If you, you'll see this line here shows your return on investment trajectory. And what venture capitalists are expecting is that you are in this bar and they will start to see return quite soon. If you secure venture capital funding and you still have to do all of your development work, all right, then you're going to come up against conflict with your funders, and you're going to have to start making hard decisions about taking the product to market before it's developed, or backtracking on commitments that you've made. And ultimately, that's really, really going to disadvantage the likelihood of success of your project overall. So this is something that at every level needs to be very carefully considered. Okay. Now, in terms of elastic design, you'll say, well, what is the elastic thing here? And the elastic thing here is your choice of financing partner at each stage, and to have some very honest conversations with them, and to make sure that the boundary that they're willing to fund definitely exceeds where you think you are, all right? If you are not 100% sure that your research is finished, then you should make sure that your angel and seed investor, if you approach at that stage, is willing to overlap into this research phase. And if they're not, then you're better off taking grant funding, which will allow you to do both. Yeah. All right, so I've touched on this briefly with the scale example around the market and customer requirements, but I want to dig into it in a little bit more detail because it's really, really critical. All right, so in this circle, we've got customer problems, okay? And in this circle, we've got solutions. So as Thabelo said, there's millions of solutions out there, and only some of them actually overlap with customer problems, all right? Now, this area here is a huge trap because people will say, oh, I've got this crazy problem, and someone will say, I've got an amazing solution for it. And especially with AI now, they'll build that solution, all right? And only once they've built it, will they be able to go to the customer and say, hey, do you like this? And they say, yeah, we really, really like it. It solves our problem. And then you'll say, okay, will you pay us for it? And then they'll say, oh, I have to go and check, if the commercials make sense. And it's at the paywall where you start to narrow down what the solutions are that customers are actually willing to pay for. And that's going to shrink your valid solution space significantly into this much smaller area, right? Now, if you've managed to do the work preemptively, which is very difficult to do, of figuring out what this will pay to fix circle looks like, and just as an aside here, it's much easier for businesses who are already in the market selling products into the solution space to draw this dotted line and to understand this circle, right? So it's always of huge value to speak to who you think might be your competitors in the space about what that problem space actually looks like, and ask them, have they tried to deploy a solution that solves this problem? And was anyone willing to pay for it? Because what you often find is that you might think that you've innovated, but actually that innovation tried to enter the market many times before. And it wasn't a question of a lack of innovation. It was actually a question of a lack of willingness to pay, right? So that's a very important aside. Stepping back, let's say you go now and build a solution in the market, all right? You might have built a solution and customers might be willing to pay for it, but now you have to look at your overheads for that solution that you've built. What is the cost of getting it into market? What are all of your overheads, packaging, shipping, marketing, running costs? It's not a given that just because you are building something inside of the space that customers will pay for, that those solutions are actually going to be commercially viable, right? So now we jump back to the question, well, where does elastic design fit into this picture? And the simple answer is that the goal of elastic design is to make the circle bigger. We want to make this circle of what you've already built as big as possible to give us the best chance that when it hits the market, it's going to overlap with this commercially viable circle. And I just want to touch on the fact that I don't want to be misleading here and give you the sense that I'm telling you to design for every eventuality. That's actually, we very rarely do that. It's a very careful practice of evaluating risk and assessing the likelihood of that change and trying to adapt to it. At the same time, it's an institutional culture of not assuming that every single requirement is locked down permanently, and understanding that there's a high likelihood that those requirements in the market, et cetera, will shift. And once you have that institutionally entrenched, you have less organizational and technological inertia to adapting your product when those changes come along. Okay, so that was very high level and market fit. We're now going to dig in a little bit deeper into what it looks like on the implementation stage, like in the technical design stage, all right? In that context, it's very important, of course, projects move through development phases, all right? You're going to start with your core R&D and you're going to move into your detailed design. You need to get through regulatory requirements. You need to go through proper manufacturer and supplier selection, and then you're going to get your product into the market and do maintenance, right? Those phases are very much there, but very easy to become myopic about which stage you're in. We're in the research stage, and that's all we need to focus on is solving this technical problem. We're in the prototype stage. We just need to build a prototype, all right? It's very important that you can see these little dots bouncing backwards and forwards here, that at each stage that you're at, that you reach forward in your journey and validate the assumptions that you're operating on, and do this risk analysis process and figure out, is this requirement, are our assumptions going to change, or how sure are we that they won't change? And if they were to change, what would be the consequence of them changing in that way, right? So very quickly, a great example of that is that if you assume a particular regulatory requirement, and then you do all of your prototyping, okay, on that assumption, or you don't even consider regulatory compliance, and you do all of your prototyping, and you build a beautiful prototype and it works, and then you get to the regulatory stage and you realize that actually you need to change something, there might be a whole bunch of work that you inadvertently did during the prototyping stage that would have made the regulatory stage really easy that you now need to go back and repeat. Whereas if you had considered the regulatory side of things a little bit earlier, you could have made some small tweaks to the prototyping stage that would have allowed you to actually execute those tests early on and validate a whole bunch of stuff that would have made the regulatory stage a walk in the park, was as close to that as possible. Another example I'd like to give is that we developed a product, a medical device, and because we did a regulatory review early on, we realized that by simply making that product multi-use instead of single-use, we could drop its risk classification, and that allowed us to skip human trials for that device completely, which was hugely beneficial. You can imagine it saved a lot of time and a lot of money, and that was a critical finding. So that there really are golden nuggets out there to be gathered if you put in the time and effort to do that analysis. Okay, so we're now going to dig a little bit deeper into what this looks like at the design implementation stage, right? So this graph is extremely powerful. Seems really simple, but it is useful to put your major components and major design decisions onto a graph like this, right? And an exercise for your team. And this graph basically says how much will it cost to change this design decision or technology, and what is the likelihood of change. And these items up here in this high risk area, all right, they really pose serious risk to your business and your development, and you should very much consider if there's a way to move them out of this high risk area. And what's of critical importance there is that if you leave anything in this high risk area, it best be related to the core technology that you're developing. It best be part of the innovation that you're bringing to the market. If you've ended up with something on the high risk end here that has nothing to do with your product, so say for example you're building that scale, and for some other reason you've chosen, you need your screen to do something on that scale, to do something magical, and it can only come from one supplier, you've done something wrong. Unless your whole product offering is related to that screen, which is unlikely for a scale, then that really shouldn't be in the high risk region, and you should be focusing on your core technology, like what your load cell sensor is, for example. So I'll discuss this a little bit more in terms of sourcing a little bit later, but there are countless different examples here, so you can take a little bit of time to look through all of these in detail. Things like tolerancing, your choice of electronics, your choice of power supply. Power supply is a critical one. People think often that it's easy to get batteries. You've got to think, batteries at volume have to be shipped by sea, and that can have a huge impact on your development timeframes, volumes that you can ship. All of that kind of stuff really actually does matter when it comes down to it. Okay. So now we're going to jump into manufacturing technologies, and this is one that I really like to talk about, because we made this mistake very early on in VMX history, where we designed a product line that worked commercially, but it only worked commercially at a few thousand units, right? Because it relied on injection molding to get the volume cost to where we needed it to be profitable, all right? And so just to be clear, these two lines here represent soft tooling and hard tooling for injection molding, okay? And this graph shows you what is the unit cost to produce an item with that manufacturing technology at a particular quantity, right? And obviously injection molding is very high up front, and then it drops to very low, whereas lower volume manufacturing technologies like machining are still quite high, and they do drop off, but they don't drop off anywhere near as much as injection molding, okay? Now, this is quite closely tied to your funding stage, right? We have goals and aspirations when we found a business and invent something and want to take it to market. It's just as important to ask yourself, what happens if instead of getting 10,000 sales over the next 3 years, we get 1,000 sales? is there a way that I can still make my business commercially viable? And how much will it cost me to do that? And these are very, very important risk-benefit considerations to weigh up. If you can, reduce your profit margin at the 10,000 unit case, to ensure that you will be profitable above 1,000 units, you've got a much lower risk investment profile, all right? And that may mean the difference between how much equity you hold on to. It may and often does make the difference between whether your business succeeds at all or not. So I'd really encourage you to look very carefully at which manufacturing technology you choose. And this is where elastic design really comes into the picture, because it's a misnomer that you have to design for one particular manufacturing technology. To house an innovation, for example, in any number of housings. So you have to ask yourself very carefully, for the market that I'm going into, do I actually need a custom injection molded housing? Should I be making something out of sheet metal that's going to allow me to get into the market at a much lower cost, to resolve what the market's actually looking for at a much lower cost, all right? And then I haven't invested in any tooling for sheet metal, so I can still do this injection molding whenever the time is right. And beyond that, there's many off-the-shelf houses. This is a critical one that we see, that people get fixated on the industrial design, on how it's going to look in the market. And in the industrial sector, for example, people very rarely actually care what it looks like, and you're better off just focusing on getting it in the market and getting the learnings from that at the lowest possible cost. Okay, so this is similar to the other graph that I showed, but this has more to do with supply chain risk. And I think many people who have been innovating since before COVID would be familiar with this. So this is really for those of you that are new to this part of the process, right? And it's easy to skip this step early on, because early on you're just prototyping. And it comes back to that question of reaching forward in your process and making sure that you aren't locking yourself into some vendor early on that you're going to have to correct for later on in the process. So this has got to do with where you're sourcing products from. And on this axis, we have the complexity or the uniqueness of whatever you're sourcing. And on this axis, we have how many sources are available for that. And again, you really want to stay outside of this top left-hand corner, all right? You want to be able to find as many sources as possible for what you're developing. And if you find yourself up in this top left corner, again, those components best be related to the core of the offering that you're developing. And even then, we very often advise our clients that it's worth, at the very least, evaluating what it would look like to move your core technology out of this box, because those changes still apply, those market shifts still apply to these things in this box. And now you've passed on that dependency onto a third party. What happens when the market requirement changes? Well, all the profit margin that they have on whatever you're buying from them in that box gets replicated each time you make a change, all right? So again, it's just really critical to look at your development from this context and try and move things out of that space. And often that means looking at what is the underlying technology and what would it actually look like for us to build that part from scratch. Is that crazy? Are we losing focus? Or is that actually the right thing for us to completely de-risk that, and then our team can focus back onto the core technology? And also just that point on profit margin is that when you buy out these components, you're baking in that third party profit margin into your cost, all right? Whereas if you vertically integrate on that component, especially if it's your core technology, then you can lock in that intellectual property and that margin. Okay, So the next one is intellectual property, and there's something I want to just, I've kind of touched on it, but I want to touch on it again here before I discuss what's shown in this figure, and that is making sure that your development of intellectual property is focused on your core business offering, right? So back to the example of the screen, you don't want to be filing patents for a screen when your the core thing you're developing is a scale. It's a huge loss of focus, and also there's not a lot of new stuff under the sun. So it is extremely difficult to secure protectable and truly inventive intellectual property. And the likelihood that you have come up with an innovation, all right, in a space where they're, in a billion-dollar industry is very small. It's just a very small likelihood. And there's not many checks and balances along the way to stop you from spending money on a patent, all right, that you might only find out here at search report 16 months down the line, and even further 30 months down the line an examination is actually undercut by a whole bunch of pre-existing IP that you simply weren't aware of, right? So make sure that you're focusing your intellectual property development on your core business offering and in a place where you really, really know the market and the space and the technology. All right, so in many ways, I've got the heading here, timing is everything. In many ways, this is very closely related to the funding question and what the right funding partner is. We will often have companies come to us and say, I'm going to come chat to you next week about this development, but I just need to file the patent first. And we have to go, whoa, 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 please don't file your patent first. Like, come and speak to us and let us have a look at your technology. Because again, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking that you've got something innovative and it's a race. As soon as you've got that patent, you've got it protected and it's yours to do with and develop as much as you like. The reality is that anyone can file a patent, right? Frankly, if you file it yourself, it only costs a couple of $100 and you don't need an attorney to file your own patent. So just bear that in mind, that lots of people do just file patents on a whim, all right? So again, it's very unlikely that you actually have something new and inventive. So where we find that people make that inventive step is in the hard graft of solving the last little bit of the technology problem. The solve that comes when you're tweaking your innovation to meet that Venn graph from right at the beginning of my presentation of what is commercially viable. That's often when the true IP is discovered. And if you file your patent too early, you'll see here you build this cumulative cost of babysitting that patent, all right? And if there's some part of your intellectual property is in that patent, you have to keep supporting it. But if the actual crux of your intellectual property is not in that first patent, you're forced to file an additional patent, and then you have to maintain both of these. And you're saying, okay, well, what's the big problem with having two properties? It just bolsters my intellectual property offering. The answer is that intellectual property maintenance is a non-trivial cost. You're really looking at, hundreds of thousands of rands, if not millions, by the time you get to national phase, right? Depending on which regions you want to protect in. And you really want to get to that stage when you have some cash flow generated, because before that, the weight of a patent is far less valuable than it was maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. At the end of the day, revenue is your gold standard. And so all of that whole intellectual property portfolio actually can become a risk on your balance book instead of being something attractive to potential investors and something that's supporting you on your journey. Yeah, so that's about all I have to share with you. Again, thanks for having me speak about all of that stuff. I hope it added value to at least some of you. I'm going to hand back to Thabelo, and we'll take it from there. I think we're going to do some questions and answers though.
Yes, we are. Thank you so much, Raphael, for that. We are going to take questions. So how it's going to work is we're going to go through a couple of rounds of questions, and each time we're going to just take 3 questions, allow Raphael to answer that, then we're going to take the next round of questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and then I will ask you to unmute and ask a question, or you can type your question in the chat. Raphael, do you want to continue sharing your presentation, or?
I'm happy to turn it off. If somebody has a question that relates to it, I'll pop it back on.
Okay. All right. I see we have 2 hands at the moment. We have Kevin and we have Tashriq. All right. I will let Kevin ask a question, and then Tashriq, you can ask yours, and then I am happy to be the third person, or Thabelo, you can ask your question as well.
Good evening, Raphael. Good evening, everybody that's joining. Raphael, I just
Evening,
wanted
Kevin.
Are you doing well?
Yes, good, thanks to you.
Good. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. It's not really a question, but I just want to mention that I found your presentation extremely insightful. I think this is the type of event I would have loved to join 12 years ago before going on the journey of innovation, because I think you are spot on, in terms of the risk you identified, especially the thing around patents, the thing about, the levels of risk from an ASIC to a connector. So I really think this is an extremely meaningful event that you hosted. And I really hope you can scale it to more events and even repeating this event. I would love to see you having a much bigger audience growing, because I think it's extremely valuable. And I think entrepreneurs, engineers, people that want to be in business, you highlighted all the problems and the mistakes that people make. And this is really a money and a time saver, just going through this presentation you had here before starting any venture. So I just wanted to commend you on a great event and spot on information. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Kevin. That's really great to hear. Yeah, when you give these presentations,
Raphael, you're not allowed to respond yet.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Thanks, Kevin.
Cool. Tashriq, you can ask your question.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Raphael, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation. It was very informative, very enlightening. I've actually one question, and that is just at the beginning of your presentations, you had diagrams, the overlapping. Is there any particular reason why you did not use a symmetrical circle? Is it psychological? Is it other? That's the first question. If I may, to lead it with the second question, let's just assume that you do have a product that is different, is innovative and requires protection. I know you mentioned don't focus on it too much. The chances of your product being very unique is very low, but let's just assume it is. What suggestions do you have that now I know that patents in South Africa cannot, well, there's no verification, there's no hearings, there's no discovery, it's only challenged in court. But what advice, if any, do you have of bridging from getting your final patent and moving on to a PCT application? Obviously, there's something like 130 countries, and the PCT only covers it for a year, and this is what I've been told. But you have to physically go and apply for the patents in all those countries wherever you would like to operate or have final protection. So on that strategy, let's just say you now move to the PCT application. What would you suggest in approaching which country, how to expand, etc., etc.? Okay, thank you.
Okay, Tashriq, you were sneaky there by asking 2 questions. But Raphael, you can go ahead and answer those 3 questions, and then we'll take the next round. And then the first question is already in the chat. So yeah, you can answer those first 3.
So I have a goldfish memory, so I'm glad we're keeping it at just those three. And thanks, Kevin, very much for the positive feedback you gave. It's really great to hear that. It really means a lot. So I very much appreciate that. Okay. So to the first question, I'm not 100% sure whether you were talking about the spider diagram or the Venn diagram, but it applies to both of them. Yes, it took a long time to get the AI to not draw circles and to draw squiggly shapes. And in fact, they're not as squiggly as I actually wanted them to be. And it is psychological. We want, but it's psychological because it reflects the reality. And it's exactly what I said to you of it being an ethos that you need to entrench in your organization, and one that's entrenched in our organization, to understand that those are not clearly defined lines, and they do change and they flex and they stretch and they move all over. And you might have seen that they were actually drifting a little bit. So just to capture the way that they change in time and with people involved and all of that variability. Okay, choosing regions to file in. So, this is extremely difficult thing to do. I think that it comes down to, again, this risk mitigation strategy. You need to look what the cost is of entering each of those markets and what the likelihood is that you're going to recoup those costs. And I would encourage you to look at that holistically. You can't just say, what is the market size, all right? You need to take your experience in actually delivering your product into the market and say, and look at all of the critical aspects of each one of those and say, how well is that going to succeed in other markets? And I think, again, this is a big area where innovation fails, and that's that your product doesn't finish when you solve the technical problem. Your product development is finished at the end of your rollout into the market. That needs to be part of your product, your entire customer experience. Can't believe I'm going to reference Apple because they're not my favorite company in the world. But if you look at their packaging, that is very much part of their product design, and it's part of the sales market. So you need to design out your road to market. And once you've done that, all right, then you can look at how that transfers into other markets and what the problems might be on quite a myopic scale. And the important thing there is you can't do that blind. So again, this comes down to timescales. If you've had the opportunity to actually sell into the local market, you would be able to test all of those theories about what that part of the product development looks like. And then you're not, guessing against the international market. You've got something that works locally, and you can check if it works internationally. And then the last thing to add there is that there are experts in this field. So if you're looking for people to chat to, we have experts that work in the UK, for example, that are very experienced at translating those requirements and deciding whether they'll work. So those are the conversations you should be happening before you choose your national phase filings, not just saying this market is $10 billion, so we're going to do it. Okay, I think that's all answered.
That they have the answer, but I think they are. So from Warren, the question is it worth to defend your proprietary software if you share your device with software in it? Is it just a given that someone is going to pinch your code at some point? So that's one question. And then a question from my end would be, this is really going back to basics. How do you define an evolvable in practice, right? What makes the difference between something that is genuinely evolvable compared to something that needs to be completely rebuilt?
Okay.
Yeah, and I see Warren made a change, ship a device. Yeah, if you ship a device with software in it. Yes, that was the question. So that is my question. Do we have another question? If not, you can take those two, then we can go for one more round.
Okay, let me answer those
too.
Thanks. Okay, so Warren, I think it depends on what your protection strategy is for that software, and that kind of applies to any intellectual property. So if your product, if you can be competed with purely on the basis of somebody copying your software, then you should definitely do everything you can, including encrypting it, to protect your firmware, all right, before you ship that product. We know that it is quite difficult to achieve that, all right? It's not without its risks or its costs or its overhead. So I would encourage you to say, is that the only approach here? Is there some other way that we can hang on to it that's going to give us some protection? Is the firmware really the thing that's differentiating us in the market? And again, just looking at it in the context of the power of AI and how easy it is to replicate some, things on a prompt, I'd say the likelihood of that is small unless you're doing something really, really specialized. So I would caution and say it's rare that it's worthwhile to over focus on that layer of protection. Ntiki, to your question about what is genuinely an evolvable product, I think the short answer is that that's a continuum. All right, so I think every product that's ever been created has some idea of some degree of evolvability to it. But I think the thing that will differentiate whether that will be of value or not is the mindset of the team and the culture of the team and the business that sits behind the entire company, and whether you are focusing and asking yourself that question at every gate, and whether that's at the core of what you're developing. That makes it an evolvable product. If you've got one champion that's saying, oh guys, that requirement might change, and everyone else in the business is saying, oh, we've got to get the prototype out, that's not an evolvable company, and it won't be an evolvable business. So it's very much, I think, the culture that defines whether it will be an evolvable business and company or not.
Right. Thank you so much. We're going to take one last round of questions. We might not get all three because I do want to have a feedback session at the end. So I'm going to ask Tashriq to go ahead and ask his question.
Hi there. Thank you very much. Just as a follow-up, I think I might be repeating what you just said now, but I'd just like a little bit more clarity on what I know as the MVP, the minimum viable product. From your experience, what is the actual balance? What is the line between sort of saying this product is good enough to go to the market and possibly produce revenue? Or do you keep on developing and developing? Because as you know, anything can be improved. You could work on something for 20 years and never get it to the market, which I think a lot of people also fall victim to. But then, and I apologize for bringing this up, but if you look at the first iPhone, their main goal was just to get rid of the keyboard. Everything else was terrible about the phone, but they evolved over time. So do you draw the line at, for example, user experience, durability, aesthetics? Where's the actual imaginary line to you, Raphael?
Well, I mean, look at Apple. They just got rid of the keyboard and never did anything useful after that, and they've been super successful. So, no, I think that the answer to that question depends very much on the business that sits behind your innovation. So, if you have an SME and you're already selling into that market and you've got revenue, then it really makes sense to move very slowly. And when I say slowly, I mean build something quickly that's presentable enough to get into the market and start getting actual market feedback and trying to sell that product, and to not focus on getting the things perfect that don't matter to the end customer or that may be important for questions like scaling. Of course, the whole thing, you've got to consider it all, but I wouldn't fixate on those things. And I do think, generally speaking, that's the best approach, but we also have to acknowledge the funding context. So if your funding context dictates that you move through technology readiness levels and get into the market with a more polished product, then you may be forced to go down that line. So again, this comes back to the question of choosing the funder. So it's a very personal approach. There's no perfect answer. It depends also on the experience of the people involved, where you draw those lines. And they're difficult questions. It does, in reality, in our experience, come down essentially to what funding you have on the table. The reality is that often these early stage developments are grant funded, and there isn't actually that much variability in the South African context, at least, in how much money you have to deliver something. So we'll often say to our clients, look, just tell us what the grant is that you've applied to, and we will help you craft an MVP that will give you the best chance of success based on the resources you have available.
All right, thank you so much. So the last question, and then we're going to move into a little bit of a feedback and close off, is from Stone. Stone, you can go ahead and unmute, and that'll be it for questions.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Michael, Raphael, for the great presentation. My question is just around building a product, but more on the design aspects of it, perhaps like. So I'm just trying to maybe if I can get a view during the process of designing, or rather that building an MVP. Mostly like in this day and age, I think a lot of people in the design space, they go with a more of an agile approach. So my question is rather around whether, as a startup, one could take the agile approach, or rather go straight head on with an MVP approach.
Can I ask, Stone, is the context that you're asking this question in pure software, or is there a hardware aspect to what you're doing?
Just a pure software.
Okay, so I think that is a huge differentiator. A lot of what I've been speaking about is in the context of some hardware aspect in the loop. Much of it does apply to software as well, but the dynamics at play there have shifted drastically with the advent of AI, right? So, I think that's a topic for a whole nother presentation, basically, to answer your question, because it does move all of those curves into a slightly different space where, your time to market is much lower, your testing cycle is much lower. And the short answer to your question there is, these days, you should probably be able to build something in a weekend. And if you can't sell what you've built after a weekend, then you're probably going to have a tough time pushing it into the market, would be my short answer there, unless it's a hugely niche, complex product.
Okay, no, thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you so much. So what I want to do now, Thabelo, you can take over just to thank our guest, and then I'm just going to run a quick feedback session, then we are done for today.
Okay, and thank you very much, Ntigi. If I do take your time as well, happy for you to stop me. But Raphael, thanks a lot for the presentation, and to everyone really who attended this event, and those questions were also insightful, or also helped in unpacking what you spoke about. While we wait for Ntigi, one thing really that I can just put out there as a comment is that we really need to start looking at a competitive advantage, if we can put it like that, as a combination of a lot of components on a business rather than on a product. And this is much specifically for hardware businesses, where patents, while they are important, they are more often than not seen as a tool to generate competitive advantage. And you can be selling something that everyone knows, but your business model and how you package your business on itself can be a competitive advantage, and you don't really have to be saying, I'm the first one to do this, or I'm protected by this to do that. However, you might know the perfect way to reach a specific niche in a specific way, and that can be a very good way of commercializing your product without stressing about somebody stealing your product. Over to you, Nsiki. Thanks, and thanks, Raphael. Really appreciate your presence.
Thanks so much, Thabelo.
All right, thank you so much. I'm just running a little Mentimeter there for everyone to join the session and give us some feedback. Give Raphael some feedback. How would you rate the quality of the session? I'm seeing a whole lot of thumbs up and clapping hands. Give him a 5, a 5 rating there. So thank you so much. This session was recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel in case you need to come back and refer to anything that Raphael said. Please also make sure to be following us on our LinkedIn, because that's where we'll be sharing all the info and any key nuggets that we got from this. I'm tempted to almost share the entire session because it was so great and insightful.
Are we supposed to scan
ahead.
Sorry, I was supposed to scan the barcode?
Scan
sorry.
the code. I see there's some tech founders in here. They scanned it real quick. That's always one marketing trick. Just put a QR code randomly. People will probably scan, just wondering what that is. So please, I see some responses coming through, and then I will move on to another question. But yeah, thank you so much. It is 7 o'clock, so if anybody needs to leave, they're welcome to do that. And if the others want to stay and just give some feedback, I would appreciate that. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is, how relevant was this content to you as a founder or inventor at your current stage? Was this relevant at all? Or was it, oh gosh? Okay, we're getting some responses in there, which is fantastic. Okay, somebody said it wasn't as relevant, so that's good to know. This is me hoping my laptop doesn't die, but let's see how far we get. All right, perfect. Let's move on to the next question. How would you rate Raphael's presentation? Now you're just rating him, not just the session.
Is this the point where, Raphael, is this the point where you cross
yeah,
your
and must I leave?
It really is. Okay, I see one more response from somebody. Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next one. Okay, were you happy with how the session was structured and facilitated? Now you're rating me and Thabelo. Essentially. All right. Okay. Happy. All right, I want to move on. Was all the communication prior to this webinar received clearly and timely for you? Right, now you're just rating me now. All right, okay, wonderful. Okay, was it easy to register? Yep. Okay, great. And all right, would you recommend the session or the webinar to anybody? Yep. Okay. Oh, wow. Those votes came in quickly. And the last question, do you intend to come through for another one? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. The other questions are more open-ended. Feel free to add that if you'd like. But that is it for today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Raphael, thank you so much again. Have a fantastic evening. I will hang around a little bit for about 2 minutes, and then you can add what your key takeaway was. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I'm still hanging around, so.
Okay.
Yeah, some great presentation there. Okay. Anybody have another takeaway? No? Okay.
Thank you once
My
again. Great
laptop.
sessions. Thank you, Ntiki. Thank
Thank
you, Raphael.
you. Thank you so much. And I think that's it. Have a lovely, lovely day.
All of
Evening.
you as well. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye.